Ayo, back at it again with another video. Thank you all for watching. I greatly appreciate it. So, a Ukraine war update video. The presidential elections just happened. Trump won. So, obviously, that's going to have some ramifications for the war in Ukraine. What kind of ramifications that'll be, we won't really see until early next year. But as of right now, basically the front in the south for Ukraine is not looking good. The line around Kherson and the Dnieper River, pretty stagnant. There hasn't been any movement ever since the Ukrainians retook Kherson 2022. The part of the line that I want to mention, Kurakhove, basically is now surrounded on three sides. The Russians are basically on the outskirts. I'm not entirely sure if this is a village or if it's a larger town, but ever since Volodar fell about a month or so ago, now there's a bulge in the line around Kurakhove. So if you are a Ukrainian soldier in Kurakhove, the Russians are to your east, to your south, and also to your north. So there's a bulge in the line, pretty much exactly what happened with Volodar. Volodar was surrounded on three sides. The Ukrainians pulled back. The Russians were able to capture Volodar. Same thing is happening with Kurakhove. Looks like the Russians are trying to push this direction towards, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, Shevchenko, probably in an attempt to try and divert resources around Pokrovsk. So Kurakhove is basically encircled more or less on three sides. The Russians are looking for a frontal assault, looks like it, or an assault towards the south, while also trying to push towards Shevchenko. Not a whole lot of movement on the line around here. Pokrovsk, more or less, this part of the line has stabilized. There is fighting in around Nelipivka, Toretsk. Looks like the Russians have made a even bigger, wedge into Toretsk. So last time they updated was just this area. The Russians have been able to move troops and personnel into this neighborhood, ultimately probably looking to try and push down here and maybe bring in more resources to try and push into the rest of the city, town, settlement. Not entirely sure the size of that. Lastly, okay, Chasiv Yar is up here. Looks like the Russians are trying to do a movement to Chasiv Yar's south while also to its north. So it looks like the Russians are trying to push almost kind of like the way that they've been doing it, capturing the capture of Volodar. They surrounded it on three sides, and then ultimately the Ukrainians pulled back. The Russians are kind of doing the same thing with Kurakhove, surrounding on three sides, hoping the Ukrainians pull back. I'll come back to this in a second, but it looks like the Russians, that's kind of what they're trying to do with Chasiv Yar. Not a whole lot of movement around Chasiv Yar. The Canal microdistrict has been under Russian control for a while. It looks like they've made some progress, but not a whole lot of progress. But it now looks like the Russians are resorting to try and pushing to Chasiv Yar south and north, hopefully to try and encircle it on three sides. That looks like what they're trying to do. So not a whole lot of movement around Chasiv Yar. Lastly, I want to talk about, there is another bulge in the line around Kupiansk. So I want to measure that. That's about 18.5 kilometers by about almost 20-kilometer bulge in the line around Kupiansk. It looks like the Russians have made it to the Encircled River, the reservoir, and it looks like what the Russians are trying to do is push the Ukrainians in this 18 by about 20 kilometer bulge in the line, ultimately trying to push the Ukrainians back towards Kupiansk and towards the Encircled River, the Encircled Reservoir. Looks like the Russians are trying to make advances around here to try and ultimately push the Ukrainians back across this line of contact, the Encircled Reservoir, the river Kupiansk, down towards Izium. So it looks like that's what the Russians are trying to do in the northern sector of the line. There is a bulge around Kupiansk that they're trying to push the Ukrainians back, and it looks like that's kind of what they're trying to do, ultimately push the Ukrainians back behind the Encircled River, the Encircled Reservoir, back to Kupiansk, and back towards Izium. Not a whole lot of movement along the Kursk front or the Vovchansk front. The Russians made progress around Vovchansk a couple months ago. The Ukrainians have been fighting around Kursk for a while. Ultimately, not a whole lot of movement around the line. I want to go back to Kurakhove. So the bulge around Kurakhove. I'm going to get a ruler. It's about a 25 kilometer at its width. Length is about another 24.5. So it's a decent bulge in the line around Kurakhove. Looks like the Russians are trying to encircle it and then ultimately try and push towards Shevchenko and up towards Pokrovsk. So Kurakhove is under a three sides encirclement, more or less. It's a pincer movement. The Russians are trying to push the Ukrainians back, and ultimately, if the Russians are successful, then the front line would look something like that. Ultimately, the Ukrainians, if pushed back by the Russians, it's still a possibility that the Ukrainians are able to push reinforcements into Kurakhove, but it looks like the Russians are trying to make this part of the line, trying to make the line look like that. Trying to push the Ukrainians back, stabilize that part of the line. And if the Russians are able to take that, then basically all of Donetsk is secure for the Russians. Ukrainian artillery doesn't really have that much of a range to hit Donetsk. Maybe if the Ukrainians put, a HIMARS launcher or a battery, maybe you could hit Donetsk. But if the Russians are able to push the Ukrainians out of this bulge around Kurakhove, then basically Donetsk is safe from artillery fire, and is more or less out of range of our Ukrainian artillery. So that's, I think, what the Russians are trying to do. Push the Ukrainians back towards Kurakhove, stabilize the line around Donetsk, and then ultimately what the Russians will try and do after that is probably focus then on Chasiv Yar. Looks like the Russians in the north are also trying to push the Ukrainians back towards the Encircled River, Encircled Reservoir, the Kupiansk, Izium direction. So that's kind of the update for the moment. We'll see how the election pans out. Obviously, that'll have ramifications for the war in Ukraine, but what those ramifications are, we will have to see when Trump is inaugurated in January of 25. So the Russians are having progress around the southern part of the line, and it looks like the Russians are making progress in the northern part of the line. The Ukrainians are in a critical spot around Kurakhove. It looks like the Ukrainians might have to push back towards Kupiansk. Whether or not the Ukrainians push back towards the Encircled Reservoir or river entirely is a different story. But if that were to happen, then that would put Ukrainian troops around Liman and Lysychansk at risk. So we'll have to kind of keep an eye on that northern sector. The southern sector is kind of what I'm worried about. The Ukrainians are basically surrounded on 3 sides. It's basically an encirclement around Kurakhove. With that being said, that is the end of the video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Deuces.